The year is 2020, and I am bored. And it's not even the pandemic yet, it's January 1st. So I decided to do something I haven't done in 10 years. I read a book, and I have never been bored since. These 10 books in series were the perfect combination of approachable and engaging to spark my love of reading. And while the first one's the one that really sparked my love of reading, the second, the seventh, and the eighth books changed how I viewed reading completely. Also, I think it's important to note that this is not a top 10 books list. This is simply books that are incredibly important to me because of how they shaped my interests and my reading journey. Without these books, the books that I love today, the books that do make those top 10 lists of mine, I probably wouldn't have read. There's a good chance I would have looked over so many different series without each and every one of these influencing my tastes. So what was that first book that sparked my love of reading? Well, you can see the top of it, you might be able to tell what it is, and as we get lower, you'll get little sneak peeks of what's coming next. But the first book was Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. In this book, we follow Wade Watts, who lives in Oklahoma City in the year 2044. The world is a dystopia, basically, at this point, and Wade only ever really feels alive when he's jacked into the Oasis under his gamer tag Parzival. The Oasis is this immersive virtual reality universe with hundreds of thousands of worlds. One of the creators of the Oasis, James Halliday, actually put an Easter egg into the game. And the Easter egg is this series of quests that is centralized around James Halliday's main interest, which was 1980s pop culture. The prize for the person who can solve all the quests first is his vast fortune and, more importantly, complete control of the Oasis. Now, there's a group of people, many people, who actually dedicate their entire lives to trying to solve this Easter egg, and they're known as Gunters, which stands for Egg Hunters. Parzival, Wade Watts, is one of these people. And even though James Halliday has been dead for 5 years and this quest has been going on since his death, nobody's even found the first quest, let alone solved it. But Parzival is determined to be the first one to do both. So Ready Player One is an urban sci-fi dystopian novel. Now, what I mean when I say urban sci-fi, because it's not actually a category on any of the reading sites like Goodreads or Fable or Storygraph, so I'll describe what I mean by it, even though it may be super obvious to everybody else. So for me, urban sci-fi is kind of like what urban fantasy is. So it's a sci-fi novel that's set in modern times in a modern world. And specifically when I say it, it doesn't have to do with outer space. So there's stuff like The Martian and Project Hail Mary, which is a sci-fi set in modern times, but then they go into outer space. This, when I'm talking about urban sci-fi, is going to be in like an urban environment. Now, because of this book and two others on the list that I'll talk about later, I love urban sci-fi. I think it's a really underrepresented genre. And so if you know of any other urban sci-fis and kind of the way I described it that you love, please let me know down below, because I am always looking for more and I can't get enough of them. So unlike a lot of fantasy books or sci-fi books, because this is set in our world, it made it something I could just jump right into, completely understand, and then just get into the intricacies of the plot rather than trying to understand the intricacies of the world, which as a new reader was huge. The other aspects that I loved about this book were the 1980s pop culture and the video games. Now, I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, but 1980s pop culture was a pretty big part of my childhood. Raiders of the Lost Ark is probably my most watched movie of all time, and I love the other Indiana Jones movies, Back to the Future, Jaws, even though I'm terrified of sharks, and that movie is probably a pretty big reason why. But this book is just a little time capsule of nostalgia, and I loved that. It took me back to playing Pac-Man in my dentist office waiting room, waiting for my name to be called with my brother. And that sort of timeless feel that this book has for people of my generation, you can't beat it. Reading about these games that I played as a kid, that I loved as a kid, but seeing them brought to life in all these really unique and cool puzzles that Parzival had to solve in his journey was really cool. And for somebody who loves video games and has since they were a kid, who doesn't want a fully VR immersive experience? And being able to read about technology and people that were experiencing that is really cool. Now, the dystopian vibes that are in this book, I wasn't sure if that's specifically what drew me to the book, but I wanted to read more. I wasn't even finished with this book when I decided to Google books like Ready Player One to see what else was out there. And so I gravitated towards the urban sci-fi element of this book on my next read, rather than the dystopian aspect. I eventually got back to the dystopian aspect, but what I really thought was driving my interest was the urban sci-fi element. And so when I Googled books, one of the first ones that came up was actually this book right here, which is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. Dark Matter follows Jason Dessen, a college physics professor who lives in modern-day Chicago with his wife Daniela and their son Charlie. It opens with them eating dinner and him drinking wine with his wife. He then walks down to the local bar to congratulate one of his longtime friends on winning a very prestigious award in the world of physics. But then on his way home, he gets abducted. "Are you happy with your life?" are the last words he hears before he just blacks out. When he wakes up, he's greeted by a lot of smiling, happy faces, people congratulating him, and that seems great until he realizes he's strapped down to a gurney and he doesn't recognize anybody. It is an incredibly intriguing book, and what Blake Crouch does so well is the urban sci-fi, and specifically the research behind it. So he comes up with a concept for a book, and he does tons of research. He talks to scientists. He really tries to understand the element that he wants to explore in his book as well as he can. He then tries to understand the one step we need to take in our world to make that technological advancement possible, and then he makes his characters take it in the book. Because he does that, it's incredibly believable. The amount of suspension of belief you have to have in his books is basically nil. It really feels like, specifically in Dark Matter, which is set in Chicago, it really feels like this could be happening in Chicago right now. And that's what Blake Crouch really excels at, and why I love his books so much. Because Blake Crouch does such a good job making his worlds believable, a lot of times reading this book, my mind is just wrestling with the implications of what if this technology is possible? What if it's happening right now? And that was a really fun sort of thought experiment as I'm reading it that I loved. And the other thing I will say is, after I finished this book, I read the first chapter of this book the same day. I finished it that night, I read the first chapter. The next day, I was up until 2, 3, 4 a.m. finishing the book. Like, I started it one day, finished it the next. Within a little over 24 hours, I was done with this book because I just couldn't put it down. Now, this is one of the books that in the intro I said changed how I viewed reading. And that's because I fell in love with Blake Crouch's writing. In the intro, I talked about how Daniela and Jason were having wine in the kitchen, right as the book opens up and before it starts. And that whole scene, when you read this book, not if, but when you read this book, that scene is what made me fall in love with Blake Crouch's writing. I could just see the image in my head of what he was trying to describe, and it was so cozy and warm that I just loved it. Now, the rest of the book is not as cozy and warm as the intro is, but the pictures he paints for you are just as real and just as tangible, which I loved. And the reason this changed the way I view reading is, if you remember, I said I was Googling books like Ready Player One because I was looking for good books. After reading this book, I Googled books by Blake Crouch because I wanted more books by him, not just good books. It was the first time in my life, other than reading Agatha Christie novels as a kid, that I went searching for books by an author rather than looking for good books. And because of this, I found so many of my favorite authors because I've explored more of their books. Because not only was Dark Matter good, but the other book that's in this list was also a banger, and I loved it. And it made me have this newfound love, this new interest in, well, if I like that book by this author, what's another one by them? Which I realize is pretty basic, but for me as a new reader, not having read a book in 10 years, that was groundbreaking, that was revolutionary. Now, the other aspect that this book explores, other than the urban sci-fi, is the thriller aspect. And that was something that I didn't realize I would love as much as I did. But because I loved it so much, the next book I went to combined elements of Ready Player One and Dark Matter. I took the dystopian aspects of Ready Player One and the thriller aspects of Dark Matter for my next book, which was The Running Man by Stephen King. It was published in 1982, but it's actually set in 2025. So it may seem like this crazy coincidence, but really it's just your sign to read this book. Ben Richards lives in Co-op City, which is a fictional city in the United States. He lives with his wife and his daughter, but his daughter is incredibly sick and she needs medical attention. But that's medical attention they can't afford. So Ben goes to the only place he knows that he can make some money at, and that's the Games Network. The Games Network hosts a lot of government-sanctioned game shows, but they're not the normal everyday game shows that we see on our TVs nowadays. These are like ultra-violent game shows. So say you have a heart condition, that means they're probably going to strap you to a treadmill and see how long and how fast you can run. Now, every step you take earns you and your family money, but every step you take also brings you potentially one step closer to a heart attack and death. After the health screening, Ben Richards isn't going to be a treadmill runner. He's actually going to the prime time, the Super Bowl, if you will, of these game shows, the Running Man. If he can survive for 30 days with an elite bounty hunter on his tail and all of America financially incentivized to turn him in, he wins the grand prize of $1 billion. So while Dark Matter cemented my love of urban sci-fi, this cemented my love of thrillers and made me curious about dystopian novels. I still wasn't sold on them, but I became more curious about those as well. But the element that it did, like I said, sell me on was thrillers. And I have found so many other good books because I read this one. Because my mind was mainly focused on the urban sci-fi elements of Dark Matter, I almost didn't catch that I was reading a thriller book, while this book, it's right in your face. I mean, it's Stephen King. He usually does horror books, but he also does thriller books amazingly well. I love his thriller books. I probably need to give his horror books a shot because, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not a huge fan of horror, so I haven't read many horror books. I think I've only read one, and it wasn't a Stephen King novel. So I need to get around to some of Stephen King's horrors, but what I can tell you is I love his thriller books. What I love about this book and Stephen King in general is just his exploration of humanity. He does such a good job painting some pictures of some really interesting characters, some very nuanced characters, but also some pretty messed up characters. If you've read any Stephen King, you know he does really well at exploring the human psyche and getting some dark characters into his pages. Another thing that Stephen King does well is having you root for somebody you feel like is a hero, but if you were, taken out of context and you were just looking at this story without falling in love with the character first, they really wouldn't look like a hero. But Ben Richards in this book is your hero, and you fall in love with the character and his motivations, and so you're cheering for him even when he does some messed up stuff because he's the good guy in your mind, and so you're all for him. The fact that this is set in 2025, I didn't even realize until I started making this until I started making this video. And when I realized that, it made me go, holy cow, that's so cool. What great timing. But also, if you guys didn't know, there's a movie coming out about this. And I think it's really clever that they decided to release it in 2025. After Dark Matter and The Running Man, I felt like I had explored a lot of what Ready Player One had to offer in the dystopian and the urban sci-fi elements. So I thought, okay, what else made me like Ready Player One? Was it the video games and the 1980s pop culture? Maybe there's something in there. Maybe there's something about that I loved so much. I want to make sure I explore that as well before I move on from the elements of Ready Player One into other aspects. So I looked for a book that had those vibes, and I found this book right here, which is The Impossible Fortress by Jason Rekulak. This coming-of-age story is set in 1987 and follows our protagonist Billy, who loves programming computer games on his Commodore 64. Now, Billy is also a teenager, so when his friends come to him with this grand scheme to steal an adult magazine from the local computer store, he's in. The plan is for one of them to get really close to the owner's daughter, Mary, get her to reveal the security code to them, and then they'll go back after hours and steal the magazine. Billy ends up drawing the short straw and has to get close to Mary, and he gets a little bit more than he bargained for because not only is she incredibly sweet, kind, and funny, she's also an incredibly gifted computer programmer who complements Billy's own skills very well. Now, with this important programming competition coming up, Billy has to choose between loyalty to his friends or loyalty to his first love of programming, and as he gets to know her more, whatever it is he's feeling with Mary. This book explores a lot of the sort of 1980s way of life. I mean, he's programming on a Commodore 64, which you probably haven't even heard of. I hadn't, and I had to actually look it up to see what it was, and it's more or less just a predecessor to the computers we have today. But being able to dive back into a world of the 1980s had a very Super 8, Stranger Things sort of feel, and I like a lot of that media. And I mean, Ready Player One had a lot of 1980s pop culture, even though it was set in 2044. A lot of the elements in that book that I liked were all the different references to the past, and this book had a lot of those. But it also had an element that I have never seen in a book. I hadn't seen it when I read this book. I haven't seen it since, and I don't know that I'll ever see it again. And it was the fact that it brought the book into the real world. So you're reading this story about Billy, his friends, and Mary. And throughout this book, Billy and Mary are working on a video game to enter into that computer game competition that I talked about in the description. You get to hear them talk about the game, describe the game, and kind of fall in love with a game that you're never going to be able to play, except that you can. In the About the Code section at the very end of the book, Jason, well, first I'll describe what the About the Code means. At the beginning of each chapter, there's code, and it's Commodore 64 code. Jason thought it'd be really cool to actually have some code in the book so you'd see what it would look like to code on a Commodore 64. And what he did is at the end of the book, in kind of the epilogue or about the author page, he has an About the Code page where he describes what that code is all about. And what he did is he actually teamed up with game programmers and created the game and put it online. And so at the very end he goes, hey, by the way, that game you've been reading about, it's real, and here's my high score. Go play it and see if you can beat it. It follows it perfectly. It is exactly what you read about. It is exactly what they programmed in the book, just come to life on the screen outside of the book. And that element to this book, that concept, that idea that Jason followed through with, it sparked just a weird desire inside of me to see how creative authors can be. Now, having finished exploring the 1980s pop culture and the video game elements of Ready Player One, I decided to go back to exploring the dystopian aspect in this book right here, which is All Our Wrong Todays. The year is 2016, except it's the 2016 that everybody in the 1950s thought we would have had. So think flying cars, free renewable energy, and any kind of food you want at the push of a button. It's basically a utopian society. Now, what would happen if somebody from that 2016 got stuck in our 2016? Well, that's exactly what happens to Tom Barron in this book. Tom Barron isn't that happy in the utopian society, and it probably has to do with how successful his dad is. He's just constantly in his dad's shadow and can't seem to find his place in the world. When Tom makes a very rash decision and the world and his life changes completely, he finds himself trapped in our 2016, which to him is like a dystopian wasteland. But something he didn't expect when he first arrived is his life here in our 2016 is actually way more fulfilling. So will he try to create a life in our messy reality? Or will he try to bring back the utopian 2016? This book did not capture me as much as Ready Player One did. The beginning, caught it. The beginning of this book, see if I can get it to stand and not fall. The beginning of this book, kind of about the first half of it, was a little meandering and slow and kind of lost me. And I probably would have stopped reading it if I had realized that's something I could do, which sounds weird. But again, I'm only 4 books into my reading journey again. And so I didn't realize DNFing a book was really a thing you could do. I just figured I've picked this book, I'm committed to it, I'll see it through to the end. And that's what I did. And I'm really glad that I did, because at about the 50% mark, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, it got really interesting and very engaging. And because of this book, I actually found one of my favorite authors later on down the road, because there was a book that I was reading by this author, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, that was also a little bit slower in the first half, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. And I sat there and thought, you know what? All Our Wrong Todays. Maybe it's another book like All Our Wrong Todays that just needed a little bit more time, a little bit more runway to get going to enjoy. Also, just seeing our 2016 through the eyes of somebody who has been to a utopian 2016, and he sees our 2016 just as a dystopian, was really cool. Because what we think of as dystopian is stuff like The Hunger Games or Ready Player One, or The Running Man, and to see our world as dystopian is very interesting. Now, the next book on this list is actually that second book by Blake Crouch, and that's going to be Recursion by, like I said, Blake Crouch. We are what we remember. Our memories make up who we think we are, our identities. But what happens when an epidemic appears that affects the mind, seemingly giving people memories they've never had, memories of a completely different life? We follow Barry and Helena. Helena? You ever have those names in a book where you've never pronounced it out loud and now you're doing it for the first time and you're not sure how it's pronounced? In my mind, it was always Helena, but Helena might make more sense. Anyways, you're following Barry and Helena. Yeah, that sounds better. A New York City cop and a neuroscientist who team up to search for the truth and try to find a way to stop this epidemic before it threatens to unravel reality itself. As I said when I was talking about Dark Matter, this is the first book where I actually went out of my way to find a book by an author rather than just looking for a good book. And I'm really glad that I did. I love Blake Crouch's writing. Recursion does the exact same thing that Dark Matter did, where he does a lot of research into this scientific probability, and explains it very well, so you understand what the implications are, what the potential is, what the possibilities are. And then he goes, oh, by the way, somebody in this book has taken that first step, and this is happening right now. So again, there's little to zero suspension of disbelief, which now that I'm saying that, I'm pretty sure I said suspension of belief previously, but there's like zero suspension of disbelief necessary to just dive right into this book, to be immersed in the world and to feel like it's actually happening, because he does such a good job with his research and his explanations and the explaining the one step that you're like, holy cow, this could be happening. Actually, in this book, there was a time I set the book down. I was sitting on my couch and I just set the book down and just stared at a wall for like 15 minutes because I felt like my brain was melting at what if this was real? How would this change the way I viewed things, the way I looked at my memories? It was a really cool mind bender that hooked me from the start, just like Dark Matter did. And this was another one I was up until 2, 3, 4 a.m. reading, because when I started reading this book to when I ended reading this book was less than 36 hours. Well, this is the second half of one of the books that changed the way I viewed reading. This next book is the seventh book. And it's another one of those books that changed the way I viewed reading. And that's actually going to be Percy Jackson and the Olympians, specifically The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. What if the Greek gods were real? What if they simply shifted their home to follow the center of civilization? And what if the center of civilization was now New York City? Also, what if the Greek gods were still as promiscuous as ever, still sleeping around with humans, popping out babies, aka demigods, left and right? Well, according to Rick Riordan, that's exactly what's happening. We just can't see it because mist covers our eyes to the mythological. Now, this is the world Percy Jackson finds himself in, but he's just a normal, everyday middle schooler, going on field trips, reading unintelligible ancient Greek, and getting attacked by furies. Wait, that's not normal for a middle schooler? Well, neither is being in a camp full of kids with special abilities and the blood of gods running in their veins, but that's exactly where Percy Jackson finds himself. What's also not normal are thunderstorms without lightning. But somebody has stolen Zeus's lightning bolt. So Percy Jackson and some of his campmates get tapped in to find his lightning bolt and stop a war between the gods. So this book isn't groundbreaking by any means. Actually, most of my friends read it when they were in middle school. It wasn't one that was required for me to read, so I didn't end up reading it until much later in life, obviously. And that was actually one of the starting points when I was looking for a new book, because this is actually the first book that wasn't influenced by Ready Player One. I actually don't even remember how I decided that I wanted to read this. It may have been my best friend Ben who was like, I read that in middle school, you should read it. But the first thing I asked him and a lot of people on the internet was, am I too old to read Percy Jackson? Like, this is a YA book. Should I be reading it? You know, I'm well over 20 years old at this point, so I don't feel like I'm in the young adult stage. Is this even something that will keep my attention? And the answer was a resounding yes, you should read it, from both my friend Ben and from the internet. They're like, it's good no matter what age you are. And they were right. And that was something that was really cool, is this book changed the way I viewed reading for a couple reasons. First off, it's the first book in this list that's a series. And that was something that was really daunting to me. Because I had just started reading, I almost didn't want to make a commitment to a series to feel like, oh, I have to read the next one. Oh, I have to read the next one. I was almost kind of waiting for my love of reading to run out and dry up. And I was afraid of that happening in the middle of a series. But I decided, you know what, I'll give it a shot. And I'm really glad I did, because it changed the way I viewed series. Instead of it being this daunting commitment, it turned into this, I have more books to read about these characters in this world that I love. And so it was almost better that it was a series rather than worse. And that influenced, obviously, my reading, as we'll talk about later. And it still does to this day, because I have way too many series, which there's actually going to be a video I'm going to put out about that. But I'm in the middle of more than 30 series at the moment, because I love them. And I can't get enough of them, because if I like the first one, that means there's more stories about these characters. And what's not to love about that? The other way this changed how I viewed reading was it opened up my eyes to YA. And it's something I'll tell you guys, and something I tell myself and my friends, is don't sleep on YA. Just because it's YA doesn't mean it's bad or written poorly. It just means it has a little bit of a faster pace. It's more easily digestible, and it's probably a little bit shorter, which aren't necessarily bad things. A lot of times after I read a pretty heavy or dark book, which Running Man kind of got me into, sometimes it's exactly what you need. And I have found so many good books because I'm open to YA now. some of my favorite books and series are YA. And it also opened me up to the idea of reading middle grade and YA books for like my future kids or my nieces and nephews. These are the books that could potentially help them fall in love with reading. I want them to love and be able to explore worlds just like I have. The other way this has changed my perspective, not in reading, but in the world, is I'm constantly out there looking around for fronts for the gods. Throughout this series, there's different stores or buildings or corporations that are like fronts for the gods, where they're still influencing the world in a more direct way through these fronts of either gods or mythological creatures. And so now when I see something in our world that feels like a front, that's all I can think of. Like, I don't know if you guys have been to Torchy Tacos, but that is 100% a front for Hades. And you cannot convince me otherwise. He's 100% back there putting together these wicked good tacos. And I just think that's a fun thing that this book sticks with me, even when I'm out in the real world. Now, this next book that helped me fall in love with reading was another fantasy book. It was another series, but it was not set in our world. It's what's called high fantasy. That's going to be Eragon by Christopher Paolini. Eragon lives in the fictional land of Alagasia. One day he stumbles upon a very polished, shiny blue stone in the woods and brings it home so he can sell it or trade it for some good food. But then a dragon hatches out of it. Now Eragon finds himself in the middle of one of the town's old storytellers' tall tales. Tall tales of dragons and dragon riders, mighty warriors who protected the innocent before the dark times, before the Empire. The Empire and King Galbatorix now rule Alagasia with fear and death, and Eragon is their public enemy number one. Evil King Galbatorix will stop at nothing until he destroys Eragon and the last remnant of the past. So high fantasy pretty much just simply means it's not set on Earth. And I'm very grateful to Eragon because it opened my eyes to high fantasy books. I don't have to be stuck in just urban fantasy because I loved this book. But that isn't actually the element that changed how I viewed reading that I mentioned in the intro, because this is book number 8. And so this is another one of those books that changed the way I view reading. And it's because I didn't actually read this book. I listened to it. This was my first audiobook and I loved it. Gerard Doyle does such an incredible job with the voices for these characters. He has just these small inflections and intonations in his voice that help you distinguish the characters. You know who's talking. And it almost helped it be more digestible because you didn't have to wait until the end of the sentence to know who's talking. I already knew who was talking. And so the theater of the mind that I love, the reason I love books is the being able to picture the book in my mind. It was just so immersive because of Gerard Doyle's narration. This next book is another high fantasy book, but it has an element that's different than Eragon, which I love even more. So this next book is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. Mistborn is set on the planet Scadrial, and on Scadrial, there's magic. Metals impart incredible abilities to those that are sensitive to them through allomancy. Also on this world are Mist, Ash, and the Lord Ruler. Mist dominates the night. Ash falls perpetually, and the Lord Ruler has ruled for over 1,000 years. Under the divinely invincible Lord Ruler, the Ska, this people group, have been enslaved. But Kelsier seeks to shake up the equilibrium a bit. Not only is he a very powerful allomancer, he's also a criminal mastermind who has come up with this ingenious plan to rob the Lord Ruler himself. But when he discovers this street urchin named Vin, who has powers very similar to his own, he changes the plan a little bit. Because why stop at robbing a god when you can kill one instead? Now, the element that I like about Mistborn more than Eragon is possibly a hot take, but I stand by it, is it's a world without dragons. Give me high fantasy without dragons. Give me high fantasy about people doing people things on a people world. I love it. I eat it up. And this is a great example of that. The other thing that Mistborn and Brandon Sanderson sparked in me is a love for hard magic systems. Now, I still love soft magic systems, but I think it goes back to Ready Player One and Dark Matter and Recursion, where I want as little suspension of disbelief as possible. And when it's a hard magic system, I don't have to just shrug off, oh, it happens because of this. Where in some soft magic system books and movies, you kind of just gotta embrace the way the author took it without sometimes there seemingly being a reason for going that direction. Like, this person's more powerful because they are. Accept it and move on. And hard magic systems just are a little bit more like realistic, for lack of a better term. And so I tend to like those more. This is also the author that, surprise, surprise, is one of my favorites. And All Are Wrong Today's actually influenced me liking Brandon Sanderson this much. Now, Mistborn, I love this book. It wasn't one of those ones that I thought was a little slow and that I struggled to get into. It was actually Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. So I read all three of these novels for Mistborn Era 1, and I wanted to read more Brandon Sanderson. So I jumped to Warbreaker, and the first half of that book is just a little bit slower for me. It didn't really capture me completely, and I thought it may be a book like All Our Wrong Todays, and I need to give it just a little bit more time. It's now one of my favorite books, and he's one of my favorite authors. And because of All Our Wrong Todays, I actually have read The Cosmere. Without it, I don't know if I would have read The Cosmere because I may not have given Sanderson a chance. I may have DNF'd, and I'm really glad I didn't. I read Mistborn because actually one of my friends that I played video games with online suggested it to me. Shout out Kanan. And I loved it. Really happy I listened to the suggestion. And so I actually listened to another suggestion that was from my then just friend, but then soon to be girlfriend and now wife, and that is Red Rising. Darrow is a red, the lowest color in the color-coded caste system of the future. Darrow lives in an era of civilization where humanity is no longer trapped on Earth, but is actually reaching for the stars. And the next frontier is Mars. Darrow and his family have been working for years to get Mars ready for terraforming. The Golds, who are the highest color in the caste system, have been overseeing this project to make sure that everything is on schedule. But when Darrow finds out he's been lied to his entire life, and his whole world is ripped from him, he'll stop at nothing to destroy those that have perpetuated this lie, even if he has to become what he hates in order to do it. Don't be daunted by the size of this book. This is actually all 3 books of the first trilogy in one, what do you call this? Tome? That doesn't feel right. My brain is dead. I can't think of what this is called. Collection? Something I didn't mention in the description in the intro is that this has a lot of Roman themes and Roman influences. So when my wife Casey suggested I read this book, it wasn't a very hard sell because Roman themes in a space opera? Yeah, I'll read it. And I actually read it after reading the first book of Mistborn because, well, I wasn't dating her at the time and I wanted something to be able to connect about and talk about and impress her maybe on finishing the book, which I did within 36 hours because I loved the first book so much. And I actually loved the first book so much that I didn't go back to the second book of Mistborn. I finished all 3 of these books within the first week. I just couldn't put them down. I was up until 2, 3, 4 a.m. reading them, just like Dark Matter and Recursion. These 3 books were another one of those addictive books that I just had to keep reading. What makes these 3 books so addictive is it's incredibly fast-paced, and there's so many different characters that you fall in love with on the good side and the bad side. And one thing that this book does incredibly well, which I think is where it gets some of the comparisons to either Hunger Games or Game of Thrones when people make those connections, is that no character is safe. No character feels safe. No character feels like they have plot armor. So when characters you love are in very suspenseful situations, it legitimately feels like you could lose them. They could be gone forever. And I love that sort of tension. I love that sort of fear because it makes it feel, I don't know, like more real, and like there's more at stake on each page. Each page you turn could be the last for that character. And I weirdly love that. A lot of people think the first book is a little slow. I didn't really feel that way, obviously, if I finished it within 36 hours. But the view I do have that's different than a lot of people is I actually think Golden Sun, which is the second book, is better than the third book. I loved it. When I think of scenes from the books, there's one that stands out to me, and if you know, you know. It's in Golden Sun, and it just left my jaw on the floor. And from that scene, these books were destined to be some of my favorite books, and they still are. And I'm really excited for Red God to be coming out, hopefully in the next year. Pierce Brown, come on, give it to us. But also take your time. I want it to be as good as it possibly can. So if you think it needs more time, by all means, take more time, and I'll be patient. But also, if you released it tomorrow, I wouldn't be mad. If the rest of these books were the spark that ignited my love for reading, this was the fire. This was the bonfire. Because as soon as I finished reading this first trilogy, I was sold. This is the turning point from reading 7 books a year to reading 38 books a year. Because I read the first one of these in either December or January. And then the next year I read 38 books, when the previous year I'd read 7 or 8 or something like that. And now I'm above 50 when I read And it's all because of this book and some habits I implemented into my everyday life. I hope you find some stories from this list that excite you as much as they did me. And if there's some books that made you fall in love with reading, let me know down below. I'd be really interested in possibly picking them up and reading them myself, or seeing if we share similar interests and opinions on the books. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel, and I've got like 50 or 60 more video ideas I'd love to share with you all. Also, if you're interested in more book content, go ahead and check out my channel. I'll be uploading there pretty consistently from here on out. But that's it for today. Thanks so much again for watching, everybody. Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.